Nichols looked up at the life-size statue of the Virgin Mary which stood on a plinth close to the back door near the confessionals, and as he passed it he instinctively tapped one of its stone feet for luck and crossed himself. The sudden grating sound of wood scraping on stone behind him made Nichols start, and he spun around and looked off down the church and over to the front doors, half expecting them to be wide open. They were closed and the charms that secured them were still in place, but as he looked around, the shadows cast on the walls from the meager light coming through the windows seemed to have shifted yet again. Dark foreboding pools of darkness lay in defiance to the light that should have drowned them out. Nichols let out the breath he had been holding as he listened, but apart from his own breathing and his heart pounding in his ears, the place was pin-drop quiet. He narrowed his eyes and peered through the gloom. Something was wrong with this picture, not just the ever-shifting shadows that were making a nonsense of the light, but something else was out of kilter. It took him a moment to make sense of what was wrong, but then he saw it. The front pew on the left-hand side of the aisle and closest to the double doors had shifted a good few feet and was now at an odd angle compared to the uniform neatness of the others. Something moved in the shadows behind the pew. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Even though the oath was little more than a whisper, the words echoed off the walls around Nichols as if he had shouted them. The pew shifted again as whatever was behind it brushed against it. Nichols jumped more at the harsh screeching sound than the movement itself. Although it was hidden from view, he knew instinctively that whatever it was had to be incredibly strong. That pew was at least 15 feet long and made of solid wood, but it had just moved like it was balsa wood. He tried to take a step back, but Nichols was getting conflicting messages from his fear-clouded brain which rooted his feet to the spot when they should have been sprinting to the back door and safety. But his brain was too busy to give the simple instruction of flight. The thing in the shadows quite simply shouldn't be there. He had placed the charms just as MacCready had instructed, but there it was all the same, lurking behind the displaced pew. The thought flashed into his head that maybe the whole placing of the charms thing had been some sick joke on MacCready's part, that those simple scraps of paper were useless and the old demon had got him to put them up just to see if he would place his faith in their supposed power ahead of his own faith in God. Just for his own amusement at how quickly Nichols would abandon his faith in favor of MacCready's dark magic. And he had, there was no denying that. "I've raised a few churches in my time," MacCready had said. Was this going to be another? After humiliating Nichols, was MacCready going to destroy this place as a grand finale? The shadow behind the pew shifted again, defying the light coming through the nearby window that should have drowned it out. The sudden movement focused Nichols' mind again back to the problem at hand. Like it or not, charms or no charms, something was in his church. And then it started. A low guttural growl like an idling power tool drifted down the church to him. Pitch perfect to induce terror into any unfortunate close enough to hear it. Although he was some 40 feet from its maker, 60, Nichols could physically feel the growl vibrate through the soles of his feet. Run! Some small part of his brain not frozen in fright was screaming, but he couldn't move even when the shadow moved out from behind the pew and into the aisle. The beast, which he had at first thought was hiding in the shadow, was in fact the shadow itself. It had the vague undulating shape of a four-legged creature, crouching low with its belly nearly dragging on the stone floor. Although the body seemed to lack any solidity, indeed it looked to Nichols to be nothing more than a seething mass of darkness, there was no doubt it still had a formidable weight to it. As it moved, dark matter almost like tar dripped from its body, but the instant it fell away from the whole of the creature it turned to smoke and drifted away. Nichols shifted his feet almost unconsciously and the creature paused for a moment as if studying him, ready to pounce at a split second's notice if he moved again. Its eyes, blood red and cat-like, flashed in the depths of the dark matter that must have been its head, then faded an instant later when it was content that its prey was frozen to the spot. The beast moved off again with the slow methodical gait of a predator. It was almost purring now as it approached the paralyzed priest. The nightmare was close enough now that Nichols could see through the dripping almost viscose darkness and to the skeletal frame beneath. Its skull was almost human in appearance if warped somewhat like wax kept out in the sun too long, and it was nearly twice the normal size. There was no room that Nichols could see for a nose on its misshapen face, which was dominated by two huge hollow eye sockets, with those piercing red eyes set deep inside, and the remainder was taken up by its mouth, which was a mass of jagged razor-sharp teeth that would put a great white to shame. The head was connected to its body by a long crooked vertebrae snaking down into the folds of murk, which thankfully was too dense for Nichols to make out anything but the faintest outline, the spindly body that lay beneath. It took one more step towards him, then stopped. The beast stopped purring as it crouched down again, poised to strike, leaving only the sound of Nichols' short, sharp intakes of breath. He tried with all his will to tear his horrified gaze away from those two eyes, burning like faint embers from deep within the shroud of darkness as it studied him. Both instinctively knew what was next, that the end was close for one of them, that The beast would strike at any moment to easily snuff out the human's life, and that it would take little longer than the space between two of Nichols' rapid heartbeats to finish the task it so wanted to carry out. But still Nichols couldn't move. Even though the fear that was strangling his brain, he knew the back door with its promise of relative safety was only a few steps away, but it may as well have been miles for all the chance he had of actually covering the ground in time to get through it. The thing would be on him a split second after he even thought about making the move. That look in its burning eyes was testament enough to that. "Go on, holy man," they almost begged, "take a step. I dare you." No, it was useless. "Sit." The curse escaped his lips as little more than a hiss. Nichols rarely swore, and never in a house of God. But, he thought, if you can't swear when faced with an abomination like this, when in God's name could you? Nichols was in no doubt. With death so close, God and the statue of the Virgin Mary over his left shoulder would understand. He shook his head. Fear was making him think of the most bizarre of things. He closed his eyes and screwed them tight shut and looked deep within himself in a vain attempt to find some sliver of the courage that had so readily deserted him, but came back with nothing but despair, and he let out a sob of anguish. He heard the beast shift slightly at this. Clearly his pain was music to its ears, but he refused to look at it, instead kept his eyes tight shut. The end was near, which prompted Nichols to say a final prayer before it came. Mostly he prayed for forgiveness. He wished he could have been stronger, not in the face of this unholy death, who wouldn't sob at the sight before him, but in so readily turning to Macready's charms for help above his own faith in God. He had desecrated the church, his church, and it had gained him nothing but shame. And finally he prayed that death would come quickly. Nichols was surprised at how much the simple prayer comforted him. He felt the fear and shame drain away, replaced by an almost overwhelming sense of serenity. "Amen," he said softly, and felt tears stream down his face. He opened his eyes, more than ready now to face his executioner with a renewed faith. The beast was gone. 6210 Nichols must have stared blankly at the place the thing had occupied moments before for a full 30 seconds before his befuddled brain managed to process the fact that it was now empty. When it did, it hit him like a physical blow hard across the face, followed instantly by one to the stomach, which made his legs buckle from underneath him, and he fell forwards onto his hands and knees. He tried to catch his breath, but when he sucked in air his stomach flipped and he had to clasp a hand over his mouth to stop himself from throwing up all over the church floor. His body convulsed and he retched violently over and over. "Oh, God," he winched and spat out a mouthful of foul-tasting bile. Nichols held his breath and tried to regulate his breathing, controlling the urge to throw up until he was sure the worst of the sensation had passed. Then he collapsed onto his backside. His mind was reeling, but not so much that he didn't know that things were far from over. Nightmares don't always disappear the moment you wake up. Life, especially now, just wasn't that simple anymore. "Come on," he chided as his until now untapped desire for self-preservation kicked in with a vengeance, and with great effort he pulled himself up using one of the nearby pews until he got unsteadily to his feet. He frantically scanned his gloomy surroundings, looking for any sign of that putrid darkness-dripping monster. Although the thing was almost twice his size, there were still plenty of dark nooks and crannies for it to hide, and he knew it could be watching him even now, ready to pounce just when he might dare to believe he could survive. But if it was still lurking somewhere quietly watching him, waiting, why? Why hadn't it ripped him to shreds when it had the chance? Had what he thought was his dying prayer worked? Had the thing sensed his renewed faith and fled? So many questions, so few answers. Another, was it still here and simply toying with him like a cat with a mouse whose hole is in sight? Cruelly enjoying the moment, giving its victim cause for false hope of survival? Nichols looked around. The charms were still where he had placed them, and he could still feel their power in the air. Perhaps the beast had sensed 63 them too. They were meant to keep the enemy out, but what if their presences had given the creature cause to pause? Still no answers, just a legion of questions to ponder as he stood there sweating in the dark. Whatever the reason, the thing was gone, for now. And that was good enough to be going on with. He was still breathing and his limbs were still all where they should be, so he wasn't complaining. Nichols so wanted to believe it had been his faith that had driven the demon away, but he couldn't deny what little sense of reality he had gnawing away at the back of his head which told him otherwise. Could it have been the charms? Or Macready himself? Nichols spun around at the thought of the old man coming to his rescue and half expected him to be standing in the doorway grinning. But the door leading to his living quarters was still shut. Macready? His voice was hoarse from the bile. He cleared his throat and without thinking spat on the floor. Macready? He shouted at this time, and his voice bounced off the stone walls around him. He waited for a response from behind the door, but none came. Either he hadn't heard or, and the thought made him shiver, the beast had somehow gotten past Nichols and claimed his true victim. After all, there was no charm on that door to stop it. And what if there had been another hiding in the vestry all this time? Perhaps the old man was already dead and the one that had been stalking Nichols in here had gone, content in the knowledge its brother had fulfilled their task and was at this moment feasting on MacCready's withered soul. "MacCready?" he said, but this time almost in a whisper, fearful of being heard. He cursed his cowardice. He had no love for the old man, but he had to be sure, one way or the other. Nichols took a tentative step towards the door when a noise close by, stone grating stone, made him spin on his heel and he faced the church once more. He hunched down slightly waiting for an attack, but nothing came. He cocked his ear and listened but couldn't hear anything but his own hesitant breathing and the blood rushing through his ears. Nothing moved in the church, be it shadow or solid, and if it hadn't been for the fact that the pew at the front of the church was still askew from interlude to his normal banal existence, nothing more than a vivid hallucination brought on by talk of demons and magic charms. He waited, breathing as softly as he could and looked from one dark corner to the next, but still nothing moved, natural or otherwise. He took a moment to regulate his breathing. Whatever had just happened, one thing was clear. He had to get back to MacCready whether the old man was alive or dead. Nichols took a tentative step backwards and without chancing to look around reached out his left hand to touch the statue of the Virgin Mary's foot which was just behind him. For luck and to give thanks that he was still somehow drawing breath. His hand touched down where her stone feet had stood for a good 200 years, but there was nothing there. He slowly craned his neck around to see the plinth she should have been perched on was empty. The priest did an almost comical double take, but the statue was gone. "What the hell?" he inquired to the empty plinth as if it could answer. "God." His head was spinning again and he almost keeled over. He had touched her foot earlier for luck as he always did. The statue had definitely been there then. He had performed that little ritual countless times before. He'd carried it with him from his previous placement as a curate to Father Jacobs at St. Joseph's in Cardiff. The old priest had done it for 40 years or more and he had in turn picked it up from the priest he had assisted when younger. Nichols had picked up the habit almost without knowing it and continued it on here. He looked around for any sign of the statue. What the hell had happened to it? Had it just got up and walked off at the first sign of the demonic trespasser? What in God's name is going on here? Nichols shouted the question in frustration and it echoed off the stone walls around him. He hadn't expected a reply, so damn near fainted dead away when it came from the shadows close by. "It's all just a kind of game, really." It was a soft woman's voice with a strong Eastern European accent. Nichols turned to the speaker, who he could now see in the shadows behind one of the confessionals. There was something not quite right about her appearance which became all too apparent when it moved. 65 Mother of God, it was both an oath and God help him a statement of fact. Nichols' legs almost gave way again at the sheer shock.